Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Molly Marin. I am the webinar coordinator for the New York State Technical Assistance Center. Just a couple of reminders before we get started today. Our presenters have agreed to distribute the PowerPoint slides before the presentation, so those are available on our webpage as they have been the last few weeks. So if you want them and need them during the presentation, please go out and get them. I can post the link again in the chat in a minute. At the end of the webinar, I will post a link to our evaluation. If you could please take a few minutes to complete that, we very much appreciate that. We do look at those every week. And today's topic, today is the first in our webinar in our pre-K series, Recognition and Response, RTI Goes to Pre-K. Today's topic is an overview and foundations of R&R, and we are very pleased this afternoon to have Virginia Bicey and Ellen Peisner-Feinberg. They are both senior scientists at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They co-direct a program of research on recognition and response, a model of tiered instruction linked to formative assessment that was developed and is being validated with funding from the Institute for Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. Bicey and Peisner-Feinberg and their team have conducted several studies to evaluate the effects of R&R on children's language and literacy skills. In a more recent study, they also developed and evaluated an adaptation of this model for addressing the language and literacy skills of Latino dual language learners. With funding from the U.S. Department of Education, they are currently working on an application of the model to improve early mathematics instruction for all children and to create targeted interventions for some children who need additional instructional supports. In 2013, they co-edited the Handbook of Response to Intervention in Early Childhood, published by Paul Brooks Publishing, and arguably the most comprehensive source of information available on this topic. Today, they will present a broad overview of R&R, including the key components of R&R and similar models and the empirical basis for using these approaches in pre-K. They have reserved time at the end of the webinar for questions from participants. Please use the chat box during the presentation to post your questions. They will be monitoring that, but answering most of the questions at the end of the webinar. And at this time, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest presenters and turn it over to them. Welcome.
Thank you, Molly. Hello, everyone. My name is Virginia Bicey, and sitting next to me is my colleague and our co-presenter today, Dr. Ellen Peisner-Feinberg. I'm going to begin today, and then I'll be passing the speaker over to her, and she will give the second half of the presentation. But just wanted to say hello to everyone. We wish we could be there with you in person. It's impossible because you're in different places, but we actually were in New York a few years back, and maybe some of you came to a session that we did for the state of New York, I think about 2 or 3 years ago. We might have met some of you. So we're pleased to be here today and to talk about something that is really an exciting educational approach for using assessment to guide instruction that has really captured the attention of educators, researchers, and policymakers, and is, I think, increasingly capturing the attention of early educators as well. So we're going to, as Molly mentioned, we're going to give you kind of a broad overview in this first webinar series presentation, and then later on we'll sort of dig a little deeper and get down into the weeds of RTI in early childhood, talk more about a specific model that we've developed, and talk about the defining components of that model in terms of the assessment component and the instructional and intervention component. And finally, we're going to wrap up with getting really practical about how would you begin to adopt this kind of a model in your program, and what steps would you need to take to begin planning for implementation. So that's kind of the way we've organized the webinar series. So we're going to get started. RTI, as I've mentioned, is something that is an exciting educational practice that has really caught on in the K-12 world, but it's still a relatively new idea in early childhood. and only recently has it begun to extend down to pre-kindergarten. Just today, I saw an announcement for a webinar that's being sponsored by Ed Week, and it's on formative assessment as part of an RTI approach. And I was thinking to myself, wouldn't it be exciting if we had a webinar focused on formative assessment in early childhood for pre-K? That's just not something that we see very often, but hopefully in the future we'll have more opportunities for professional development on topics such as formative assessment. With its emphasis on monitoring student progress, I think RTI is a logical extension of evidence-based practice and more recent reforms that are focused on measuring and improving teacher effectiveness in relation to student achievement. At the same time, this idea of using RTI practices to support learning and development prior to kindergarten has sparked widespread interest in early childhood, but the field is at a very, very early stage in understanding how RTI will work in pre-K. In addition, the field is only just beginning to gather research evidence to measure the effectiveness of this approach for improving student learning and development and to understand how it can be implemented with fidelity. We also, in early childhood, we lack policies and we lack the resources that school districts need to be able to implement this approach. So there are many things that we lack, but we don't lack enthusiasm, interest in this particular area. And I think going forward, these policies and resources will be more available. Switch gears for a minute now and talk about the federal legislation and policies. As I mentioned, there are policies and there is federal legislation for students in K-12, but nothing specifically for pre-K at this time. For school-age students in K-12, there are federal and state policies along with many resources that guide the use of RTI in schools. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004 includes specific provisions in RTI for students in K-12. These provisions allow school districts to use RTI as an alternative method for identifying students with learning disabilities. Schools may also use a portion of their funds for academic and behavioral supports for students not yet identified as learning disabled. Okay, I've been using the term response to intervention, or RTI, but this approach is known by many other names and is called different things by different states and by different school districts and other organizations. Let's take a look at some of these terms that are being used. Okay, so you see some of these terms bouncing across your PowerPoint slide, hopefully. Response to intervention. Sometimes people change that intervention word. They change the I to instruction and call it response to instruction. Tiered instruction is another term that's used to refer generally to this approach. Another term that's frequently used is multi-tiered system of supports, and that's abbreviated as MTSS. I've also heard it called RTI squared, referring to both instruction and intervention. Positive behavioral intervention and supports, or positive behavioral supports, refer to RTI models that really focus on behavioral systems and children's social emotional development. It's also referred to as system-wide PBS. There are also some state-specific terms for RTI. Just a couple of examples. One is MyBLISSY, you may have heard of. That's the Michigan program, and it stands for Michigan Integrated Behavior and Learning Support Initiative, and they refer to it in shorthand as MyBLISSY. In Connecticut, they talk about SBRIs, Scientifically Based Research Interventions. In New York, they call it RTI, Response to Intervention, and interestingly, I noticed on the website, in the State Department's website, that they talk about RTI as being applied in in P through 12. So rather than K-12, it's T-12. So I was pretty happy to see that. Also, they have guidance from the New York State Education Department on response to intervention, and you might want to take a look at it if you haven't seen it, especially since they really talk about it as P to 12. They refer to response to intervention as the practice of providing high-quality instruction and intervention matched to students' needs and using learning rate over time and level of performance to make important educational decisions about an individual student. I thought that was a nice definition. The New York State Department has established a regulatory policy framework for RTI in relation to school-wide screenings, minimum components of RTI programs, parent notification and use of RTI in the identification of students with learning disabilities, and the policy establishes RTI as a school-wide system of organizing instruction and support resources to deliver high-quality instruction to meet the diverse needs of learners. So you might want to check out those policy guidelines if you haven't seen them yet. So what are the origins of this approach in early childhood? Well, the origins of tiered instructional approaches in early childhood can be traced directly to conceptual models of RTI for school-age students, and that's not too surprising. And then prior to that, it can be traced to a classification model addressing primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention in public health. So let's take a look at some of those models. Okay, so this first figure shows the public health model in relation to a generic school-based RTI model. And you can see that both are organized by level of intensity in terms of the interventions and supports. So the one on the left is the one that is the precursor to RTI, and it really came from public health, and it's a way of thinking about primary promotion and prevention. And you start with thinking about, how to do that for the entire population, and then as you move up that pyramid, you think about offering more intensive interventions to fewer numbers of people. The same model on the right-hand side applies to RTI models for school-age students, where you first begin thinking about the foundation of instruction for all children, and then as you move up, you include some targeted interventions and supports for some children who need them, and then at the very top, you have the most intensive interventions for a few children who need those. Okay. In this figure, you're seeing two aspects of RTI, one focused on academic systems and the other on behavioral systems. Originally, RTI was conceptualized around academic learning in reading and math, but a similar logic is used in models focused on behavior, and these models are generally called positive behavioral supports, as I mentioned earlier, or PBS, or positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, or sometimes school-wide PBIS. Okay? The similarities between these frameworks is illustrated here in this side-by-side comparison of PBS and RTI. Although, if you look at it closely, the issue of implementation is not addressed. It's not clear, for example, how you would actually implement a model that focused on both academic and behavioral systems. I think that's something that the broader field of education is still working on. Okay. In this figure, you see a framework that was developed in 2012 by the National Professional Development Center on Inclusion. They published this framework to advance understanding of how RTI might work in early childhood. And again, it's very similar to what I showed you earlier. The model first addresses all children at the base of the model in terms of offering and providing core curriculum and intentional teaching. And as you move up, there's a recognition that some children are going to need more targeted interventions and supports. And moving up even further to the very top of the triangle, a few children are going to need those intensive individualized interventions and supports. So it's a way of organizing instruction. This is the recognition and response model that Ellen and I and our team developed here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with funding from the U.S. Department of Education. Again, you'll see a strong similarity between the other models that I showed you, the same triangle, the same notion of organizing instruction and intervention by tiers of, in terms of levels of intensity of instruction and intervention. I think an addition here that you see that you didn't see in the other models is a focus on the assessment component. And it is referred to as universal screening in Tier 1 and progress monitoring at Tiers 2 and 3. But essentially, those terms all refer to assessment that's used within the recognition and response model. It's also used within RTI models. And teachers use that information to determine whether some children might need some additional supports, to monitor their learning and how well the interventions are working, and to really monitor everybody in the classroom. And then all around that triangle, you see something called collaborative problem solving, which is the framework or the method that's used to really support the implementation of a tiered system, both in RTI and in recognition response, which was developed specifically for pre-kindergartners. So I'm showing you some very specific models in early childhood right now, whereas earlier I was showing you sort of models that were precursors to these specific models in early childhood, or they were generic school-age models. This one is called the pyramid model, and it was developed by Mary Louise Hemeter and Lisa Fox and their colleagues, and it focuses on behavior and challenging behaviors in young children and their social emotional development. And so this is the same idea in terms of thinking about organizing instruction and behavioral supports by level of intensity. They actually start with having an effective workforce, so they have a very they really have backed up in terms of thinking about the foundation that would be needed. Then they move up from there to talking about nurturing and responsive relationships as being foundational in terms of thinking about how to support children's development in the area of social and emotional development. And then from there, they move up to high-quality environments. And then for children who need them, targeted social emotional supports and intensive interventions. So those are some of the origins of response to intervention in early childhood. Okay. There are a lot of different terms that are used in response to intervention, both in the K-12 world and in early childhood. So we thought it might be helpful to just go over some of that terminology so that we have a common framework or a common language for talking about these concepts. Early intervening versus early intervention. They're so similar, but they really have different meanings. Within RTI, early intervening means addressing children's learning needs prior to referral for evaluation for special education. And as I mentioned earlier, there's actually a provision within IDEA that allows school districts to use some of their funds, some of their special education funding, to focus on meeting the needs of children who don't yet have IEPs. So these are really pre-referral interventions, and it's part of the process of determining whether or not a student actually has specific learning disabilities. So that's what we mean by early intervening. I think most of you know what early intervention means. It refers to special education and family support services for eligible children birth to 3 with disabilities at risk under IDEA. But outside of early childhood, people sometimes confuse these two terms. But I think those of us in early childhood understand that early intervention has a very specific meaning that's distinct from early intervening within RTI. Learning difficulties and learning disabilities, those two terms sometimes are confusing to people. Learning difficulties refer to students who have problems in acquiring key academic skills. And sometimes we say that these students are at risk for developing learning disabilities or at risk for developing reading disabilities or math disabilities, for example, but they really don't have an identified disability. But they may have a difficulty in learning and struggle in different areas of learning. Learning disabilities refer to students who have an identified disability that require special education services under IDEA. Okay? So that's the distinction there. Tiered and multi-tiered, we hear those terms a lot, and even the different states use these terms quite a bit. These terms are used interchangeably within RTI to describe a system of instructional supports organized by level of intensity. These same terms can be used and are used within PBS to describe a system of behavioral supports organized by level of intensity. So, in effect, these terms have the same meaning and can be used interchangeably. Problem solving. Okay? Within RTI, problem solving means working collaboratively with parents, teachers, specialists, and administrators to plan and evaluate tiered instruction based on formative assessment results. So it's really that special process that is established as part of RTI. And often the process is established through teams, so they might call it a problem-solving team. And the process is used. The team is different than other kinds of teams within special education or within professional development, because this one's really focused on implementation of RTI. And so the idea is to help teachers use the assessment results to make good decisions, to evaluate the tiered interventions, and to monitor progress. But teachers often need support, and collaboration can strengthen the process of using assessments to make instructional decisions. So that's the idea behind problem solving. Instruction and intervention, these terms, we think we know what they mean, but we find that people sometimes mean different things when they say them. So we try to be very clear within RTI. Instruction means the general curriculum and intentional teaching that all children receive. That's instruction. It's foundational. All children receive it. Intervention means the instructional or behavioral supports that some children receive based on formative assessment results. So if you go back to the word intervening, it means you as a teacher are doing something special for some children because you have some information, some data, some assessment results that tell you that some children need additional supports. So you're creating some interventions or implementing some interventions for those children. So that's the distinction between the two. Small group instruction. This is really important. We work with a lot of different teachers and a lot of different school districts, and there's a lot of confusion right now about small group instruction. I think we try to differentiate the meaning of small group instruction within RTI and outside of RTI, because small group instruction is something that existed before RTI within early childhood, and sometimes we think that RTI is having some influence on that, and it's important to try to differentiate and to preserve the meaning of each of those different ways of using it. So let me try to explain a little bit about how we think about small group instruction within and outside of RTI. Within RTI, selection of target children is informed by formative assessment and is determined through a collaborative problem-solving process. Small groups are limited generally to 3 to 6 children. Okay? So that's what we mean within recognition and response, or within RTI. That's what we mean by small groups. It's focused on a group of target children who receive this small group instruction. Outside of RTI, child choice primarily determines how groups are formed, not the teacher. The size and composition of these groups vary depending on children's interests and their ability levels. So that's a big distinction between the two, between how children are selected or how they choose to be a part of these small groups. Within RTI, The focus of small group lessons is on specific skills within a certain content area, like language or literacy and math. Instruction within these small groups are developmentally appropriate. The lessons are structured and sequenced. Outside of RTI, various activities are planned to address thematic concepts and or broad curriculum goals that are designed to meet the needs of all children. The instruction consists primarily of child-initiated activities in interest centers rather than teacher-directed lessons. Okay? Within RTI, the role of the teacher is to explicitly teach lessons to small groups of target children using research-based curricula or instructional strategies, and to systematically monitor progress of these children using formative assessment. Outside of RTI, the teacher's role primarily is to observe and monitor all children's participation in various learning activities and to encourage and facilitate their participation in learning as needed. Formative assessment. Within RTI, formative assessment is typically gathered by classroom teachers to guide instructional decisions. And we talk about two types of formative assessment, and actually that's not just us talking about it. This is how generally within RTI there are two types of formative assessment, universal screening and progress monitoring. So the way we talk about it is very consistent with RTI in general. Sometimes there is confusion about universal versus developmental screening. And I think most of us in early childhood are very familiar with developmental screening, okay? But the universal screening is a newer practice for many of us. Within RTI, universal screening means formative assessment to determine whether some children need more instructional support. Okay, this is screening that happens on a regular basis with all children and is usually very brief and easy for teachers to administer. Developmental screening, on the other hand, means assessment to determine whether further diagnostic evaluation is needed. And this usually, typically involves a specialist doing some kind of developmental screening rather than the teacher, although teachers can be involved as well. Typically, this screening is a little more involved, and but the whole purpose of this is to determine whether or not children might need further evaluation and perhaps special education services. Progress monitoring. Within RTI, this means formative assessment to determine how children are responding to both the foundational instruction that they receive at Tier 1 as well as the targeted interventions. So that's that's a type of formative assessment that really focuses on just the target children. Okay, these are some other terms related to assessment that get used in early childhood, and some of the terms are also used within the broader RTI world, and they are very confusing to people. So we're going to go over these terms quickly. Within RTI, curriculum-based measures are brief measures of key academic skills linked to later achievement in reading and math. Okay? And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of those in early childhood. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples because we only have a couple of measures and at this point. One example would be the individual growth and development indicators, or the IGDs. I'll say that again, the individual growth and development indicators, IGDs. And there's a website called Get It, Got It, Go that is used to help manage the information gathered through the IGDs. Another example, and this is a tool that we've used quite a bit in our research, is called the Circle Phonological Awareness Language and Literacy System Plus, or CPALS, C-PALS. Again, I'll repeat that, Circle Phonological Awareness Language and Literacy System Plus, or C-PALS. Okay, those are just two examples of what we would call curriculum-based measures. The other term that you hear quite a bit is general outcome measures. But that's just another term for CBMs, or curriculum-based measures. It's generally not a term that you hear in school-age RTI. You do hear CBMs in school-based RTI, but you don't generally hear GOMs. And then finally, curriculum-based assessments. Those are assessments that are linked to the goals of a specific curriculum. And I'll give you an example that I'm sure you're very familiar with. The creative curriculum is a specific curriculum in early childhood, and a curriculum-based assessment that's linked to it is called Teaching Strategies Gold. And that is a tool that is designed to be used only with that curriculum and not another curriculum. So those are terms and some examples related to assessment in RTI. Okay, next I'd like to just share with you what we consider to be some defining features of response to intervention in early childhood. These are the same, I believe, the same defining features of RTI for school-age students. The first is formative assessment, and I've already talked about that, so this will sound familiar, I hope. It refers to information that's gathered on children's development or their skills that's used to inform instructional decisions. Universal screening and progress monitoring are particular types of formative assessment used within RTI and within recognition and response. Universal screening involves gathering information periodically on all children, usually fall, winter, and spring, to monitor their development and learning and determine whether some children need additional instructional supports. Progress monitoring is used to gather additional information on some children who receive targeted interventions to determine their responsiveness to those interventions. Okay, that's the first component, formative assessment. The second is foundational instruction and tiered interventions. Okay. An effective core curriculum and intentional teaching are foundational in any response to intervention system. Targeted interventions are used with some children who require additional supports and generally provided through small group instruction and individualized scaffolding. And by that we mean response prompting, modeling, peer supports, and so forth, with scaffolding representing the most intensive level of instruction. All children receive foundational instruction, some receive foundational instruction and small group instruction, and a few receive foundational instruction, small group instruction, and scaffolding. Okay? So there, the concept of all, some, and a few is something to kind of help you remember this tiered notion, with all children receiving foundational, some receiving the small group instructions, and a few receiving both of those plus the scaffolding. Finally, the third important component consists of supports for decision-making and implementation. RTI includes a process or methods that practitioners can use to collaborate with families, specialists, and others to plan instruction, targeted interventions, and to evaluate how well children are responding to them. In addition, system-level supports are really critical, and those include things like ongoing professional development, methods for gathering and reporting assessment results. For example, technology is very important within RTI because it's very taxing for teachers to gather so much information, so we try to make it as easy as possible for teachers to do that, and so we need technology. We need web-based assessment systems so that teachers can gather information with computers, with the help of computer tablets and other devices, and to upload the data to web-based systems so they can easily generate the reports they need to make decisions and share information. And finally, they need some resources for how to share information with families and other professionals in order to support an RTI approach. Okay, so at this point, I am going to transition over to my colleague, Ellen. She's going to talk about some widely used models of RTI and Pre-K. I've already touched on those a little bit. So, Ellen, I'm going to pass the microphone to you.
Thank you. So let me talk about a two of the more well-known models of RTI for pre-K. Recognition and response is a model that is focused on academic learning. It particularly looks at language, literacy, and math instruction. Second model is the pyramid model, which is focused on addressing social emotional development and challenging behaviors. Let me first talk about the recognition and response model. Let's look a little more deeply at that one. We'll start by looking at the foundation of recognition and response. It actually consists of 3 tiers. At the first tier, we see foundational instruction for all children. That consists of research-based core curriculum and intentional teaching. Along with that, there's formative assessment to determine whether some children might need additional instructional supports to learn key school readiness skills. What we then add onto that model at Tier 2 is based on the results of the formative assessment. At Tier 1, we determine whether there might be some children who also receive explicit small group lessons focused on key skills. That may be key language and literacy skills, it may be key math skills, depending on the focus of the model, along with embedded learning activities to reinforce those skills through other activities. In addition, there's continued formative assessment for progress monitoring to determine whether any adjustments to the intervention and instruction are needed for these children. Because, again, this is an additive model, we then build on top of that, we add Tier 3. At Tier 3, again, based on this formative assessment results, we determine whether there are a few children who still are not making adequate progress, even with the Tier 1 foundational instruction and the Tier 2 small group lessons and embedded learning activities. And so at Tier 3, what we add is individualized scaffolding strategies. These consist of things like modeling, prompting, peer supports, corrective feedback, along with continued progress monitoring to determine whether any further adjustments are needed. We then, this whole entire process is surrounded by a collaborative problem-solving process to help support decision-making for teachers to review the formative assessment results, as well as support their implementation of instruction and intervention through a community of practice or professional learning community approach, which involves teachers, administrators, and facilitators helping teachers support this. The next model that we'll look at is the pyramid model. The pyramid model is also based on a tiered approach, but it's focused on social emotional development and challenging behaviors. It starts broadly with an effective workforce and evidence-based systems and policies. It also includes foundational practices for all children. These include nurturing and positive relationships and high-quality supportive environments. It adds targeted social emotional supports for some children, which are designed both to prevent and remediate problem behaviors. And then at the upper tier, it adds intensive individualized interventions for children who need individualized behavioral support plans. In contrast to the recognition and response model, there's no clearly defined child-level assessment component within the pyramid model. It's focused on instruction and intervention that addresses both positive social skills, the preventive side, and challenging behaviors, the remedial side. There is a measure that some of you may be familiar with connected with the pyramid model called the teapot, but that's really focused on fidelity of implementation of the model, not on child-level assessment. The question is there any evidence to support response to intervention? What is the research evidence behind this? So let's take a look at what we know. Well, there is evidence to support the efficacy of response to intervention for school-age children, but there's not yet evidence in pre-K. There are studies underway in the field. The evidence is emerging, but there's not yet an established evidence base. However, we can look and say, well, what have we learned from the school-age literature that might help inform the directions that we need to go? Well, one of some key sources, one is a meta-analysis that was done of 24 studies. And this actually compared studies that looked at children who were attending schools that were implementing RTI to children who were attending schools that were not implementing RTI. And the findings from this meta-analysis showed that students who attended RTI schools had more positive outcomes compared to those in schools that were not implementing RTI. Students in the RTI schools had greater growth in academic skills. They had more time on task. They had better task completion. And in addition, those schools showed a reduced need for special education. Another important source is to look at the practice guides that have been produced by the Institute of Education Sciences from the U.S. Department of Ed. These are an authoritative source on the implementation of RTI. They're based actually on the research to date in various areas. One of them has to do with looking particularly at research in the area of reading. And there were 4 major conclusions from this that support the use of RTI approaches in this area. One of those is that universal screening does predict children's future performance in reading, so that is actually, there is a connection there. Secondly, one of the conclusions from the research was that progress monitoring facilitates teachers' instructional decision-making. Third conclusion was that small group interventions, such as those at Tier 2, for at-risk students actually showed strong evidence of efficacy. In other words, they actually had positive outcomes for those children. And then finally, an important fourth conclusion is that when differentiated instruction was practiced at Tier 1, there was little evidence of that having any impact for children. So basically, that where this was effective was in terms of providing these small group interventions at Tier 2 had positive effects, but providing such differentiated instruction at Tier 2 really did not have a positive effect for children. A second practice guide was produced in the area of math research and actually came to very similar conclusions. Again, that universal screening predicts children's future performance in math, that progress monitoring facilitates teachers' instructional decision-making, and that targeted interventions for at-risk students showed strong evidence of efficacy. Another source that's come out very recently, just this current year, is a new synthesis of studies conducted by the Institute of Education Sciences that looked at improving reading outcomes for students that either have or are at risk for reading disabilities. And this was a synthesis of studies that were actually funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. And again, they found evidence to support the use of RTI approaches with school-age children, that both screening and progress monitoring were valid and efficient ways for identifying at-risk students, as well as for guiding decision-making and evaluation, and that increasing the intensity of instruction in school age, kindergarten through 3rd grade, can actually help prevent later reading disabilities, an important conclusion. So, based on these sources, as well as the broader literature in the field, 3 key recommendations for practice that we in the early childhood field can take and that should underlie models of RTI for pre-K are that the foundation of RTI should be high-quality instruction and universal screening for all children. That's what we should think about in terms of what the Tier 1 should look like. That targeted interventions for some children should be systematic, explicit, and evidence-based. And finally, that children's responses to intervention should be monitored to determine if adequate progress has been made and to make adjustments as needed. That progress monitoring is an important component of these models. So, as we've seen, there's a lot of evidence from the school-age world about what we know in terms of using RTI, but because this is an emerging practice in pre-K, there are still many questions about the use of it. What are some of these questions? Well, what practices define RTI? What should we be doing around assessment, around instruction, around intervention? Because this is still a new practice, we don't really know a lot about the tools. We don't really know a lot about how to actually do these. Who should implement these practices? Well, clearly we would say that teachers should be the ones that are implementing these practices, but what should be the role of specialists, of administrators, of parents even? I think these are questions that as programs begin to implement RTI, that they need to address these and come up with a plan. Which children and families are affected? There are some practices that clearly will affect all children in all families, but some may be implemented with just a target group. For many pre-K programs, this is actually a new idea, that you might have some things that you do within your program that are specifically directed toward just some children and not actually directed toward all children or needed for all children in the program. That's actually a new way of thinking for many programs. Who benefits from these practices? Well, we would say that hopefully everyone benefits, that on the program side that teachers and administrators benefit in terms of learning some more efficient ways of implementing practices and some higher quality ways of implementing, as well as the children and families for the very same reasons. And then finally, how does RTI fit with existing practices around assessment, instruction, and intervention? When this new approach is implemented, what needs to change? What can be added? What can be removed? These are all issues that programs need to figure out as they begin to implement these approaches. There are a number of issues to think about in terms of actually implementing RTI in early childhood within the broader field and the broader system. These include a lack of consensus around the meaning of RTI. As you saw at the very beginning when Virginia introduced this session, there are a lot of different terms that are being used. There's not always agreement on what these terms mean. There's different definitions. There's different models of RTI that are out there that, you know, as a field, we don't have one single idea of what RTI means. There also, as we've gone around and talked to a lot of different people across the country about RTI, we've seen that there are a lot of what we call urban myths about RTI. We've heard things like, well, you know, it's intended to replace special education, or, you know, our program, we're concerned that it's going to delay referral and services, that it's here instead of providing children with the services that we need. We would argue that a good implementation of RTI should operate as a parallel system, that it should never prevent children from receiving other services that they are eligible for or that they need, but the services should operate in tandem. There's confusing and limited information available, as you've seen just from some of the comments I've just made, as well as, you know, what we felt was important to explain a lot of the terms and a lot of the models that are out there. Because this is still a new practice, there are limited examples out there and there's limited research that's out there. Correspondingly, there's a lack of experience and resources within the field. There are not a lot of assessment tools available. There are not a lot of instructional materials or curricula out there. There's almost nothing that's been specifically designed for RTI in pre-K. There are some things that will work, but not a whole lot of things that have been specifically designed for this purpose, again, because this is still an emerging practice. And then finally, we can't ignore the challenges of the currently fragmented early childhood system, the context within which this is going to be implemented. We don't have a single unitary system like we do in the school-age education world, where there's no overarching entity at the local, state, or federal level to help provide resources or guidance to help us in the implementation. So where does that leave us? Well, there is one resource that we hope might help you, and that is a book that we published last year. It's an edited volume. It had over 60 contributors, called The Handbook of Response to Intervention in Early Childhood. That is a resource that's available for any of you who are interested. There is a code here. You can actually order it with a 10% discount from Brooks Publishing. And a lot of the information that we talk about, actually there are a lot of resources here that might help you in this. And you can actually access a free chapter if you want to see a little bit more about recognition and response in particular, which will be the focus of our subsequent webinars, that you can actually download that. Brooks Publishing has made that available for free at this particular web address. So hopefully that's one resource that might be available to people as well. So that actually concludes the formal presentation part of our webinar. We have about 15 or 20 minutes to address some questions that have come up from participants at this point. So I'm going to put Virginia back on the phone, and she's going to address something that's come up at this point.
Hello, everyone. I'm back. I don't think we got too many questions, but one question was the name of the book, and I think Ellen just answered that question. I think another question was around what curricula did we use in our research. And I'm going to provide an answer to that question, kind of a short answer. This is something that has been evolving throughout our research throughout the years. We're actually getting ready to conduct about Study 5 now, but we have not been specifying the curriculum at Tier 1. We have screened programs to make sure they're of high quality, to make sure that they do have a comprehensive core curriculum, but we haven't specified what curriculum people need to use at Tier 1. We have, in the area of language and literacy, we have ensured that there is a curriculum, and then we have focused on helping teachers implement tiered interventions that would complement and address those same learning targets that appear in that core curriculum. And in terms of what's being used, there are quite a few different, there are an array of different curricula being used out there in language and literacy. Sometimes we find, actually we find quite a bit that that creative curriculum is being used as a comprehensive core curriculum. But sometimes there are curricula being used that we've never even heard of. Some are research-based, some are not. Sometimes people use a language and literacy curriculum. So we find all different types of models out there in terms of what's being used as foundational curriculum. I will say that we're now working in the area of math, and we're finding that teachers really aren't using a curriculum, a specific curriculum in the area of math. And so we're changing our approach a little bit and deciding that at this stage, it's so important, and so, as we've been saying, the foundation of this whole approach is you've got to have a good, solid curriculum at Tier 1. And so for our new project, we are actually specifying a particular math curriculum that we're asking teachers to use at Tier 1 with all of the children, so that we can be assured that every child is exposed to foundational instruction and good foundational instruction, because we're going to use a research-based curriculum. And then we're going to develop our small group lessons that complement that Tier 1 curriculum. So our thinking on this has evolved. We used to focus mainly on developing tiers 2 and 3 in terms of the interventions, and now we're really thinking about the whole enchilada and really thinking about, we're intervening more in the area of tier 1 now, especially in the area of math. So any other questions? I'm trying to see if I'm reading quickly on the screen to see if there are any other questions. Are there any guidelines, specifications for documentation? I'm trying to understand that one. In terms of, and I'm thinking maybe this question has to do with you're thinking more like an IEP, the kinds of documentation that you might do. Yeah, or so I'm not sure if you're thinking more about like an intervention plan, that kind of documentation, or if you're thinking more about it from a broader perspective of implementation, some kind of guidelines and documentation. We, generally speaking, in terms of how this is implemented, we really don't focus too much on individual intervention plans. We do help teachers use the formative assessment results, generate reports, look at the distribution of scores, and then on the basis of that, they are looking to see which children are really falling at the sort of the top of that distribution and which ones are in the middle and which ones are at the bottom. And we really help them go right to that bottom end of the distribution in terms of figuring out who might benefit from some additional small group instruction. We, as part of the research, of course, we do document, which children are getting the targeted interventions, their exposure to the small group lessons. And so as part of the research, there is some documentation to help us understand children's exposure to to the intervention, as well as we have access to all of the assessments that are being gathered. Anything to add to that, Ellen? No. Okay, so that's, unless there's clarification, I think that would be our response to that question. So I'm just going to read this one so that there's not silence at the other end of this presentation. But it's one thing I heard you mention during this presentation is this is such a new program. Can pre-K teachers sign up to be test participants in implementing RTI in our classrooms? That sounds like a very enthusiastic person out there that just wants to jump in and do this. I wish there were more teachers like that. I think there are. Actually, I have to say that when when we're going around recruiting school systems and teachers, we do meet teachers that are very enthusiastic. Most of the teachers want to do a better job meeting the needs of their students. And they're excited about the technology when we show them that it's not going to be too demanding on their time to actually gather the information, because we're going to give them a computer tablet. And I'd like to say iPad, but there are other computer tablets that can be used as well. But they're pretty excited to be able to use that to gather the information. They don't have to use paper and pencil. And they don't have to worry about, filing this away somewhere and doing any kind of like calculations by hand. It's all done through the use of technology. So they're excited when they see their students' scores. And what they're really excited about is when they see those scores going up over time after, after children are exposed to small group lessons after a 2-month period, and they see those scores going up, and they're very pleased to see that. We're pretty restricted in terms of how we have to go about our recruitment. I wish we could just sign people up who just volunteer. I wish that would be wonderful. At this time, though, we have to follow a very rigid protocol in terms of which schools we work with and so forth. But thank you for volunteering. I wish we could work with everybody out there. Another question you want to respond to? Okay, here's one. What is the Tier 1 math curriculum that you suggest? Okay, I thought that question might come up. So you might be interested to know we did a really, we took a lot of time looking at the literature, looking what was out there. And we actually ordered many of the curricula, and we looked at the research evidence behind it, behind each of them. And there were 2 or 3 possibilities. But we we ended up with the curriculum building blocks, which is Doug Clement's program. And I believe he was actually in Buffalo, New York when he developed it, I think. He's not there anymore, though. I think he's out in Colorado. So that's the one that we are using in our current IES project. We are using that curriculum. We're going to have teachers implement that curriculum, and then we're actually in the process now of developing the small group lessons that complement it. And the good thing is that curriculum actually has a small group lesson component. It just isn't very explicit, so we're just taking that and we're just making it a little more explicit and easier for teachers to implement, getting all the materials organized for them so that they don't have to go running around making things and looking for things. So we're just trying to get it more organized for them. So that's what we're doing now. Okay, so a question is, have you worked on a model for working through the RTI process for timelines, decision-making, assessment review, etc.? We have worked with probably 3 or 4 school systems now with that very process that is described in that question. And so we will share with you what we've learned from working with school districts to start from scratch in terms of implementing an RTI process, and we will do that in the very last webinar. So if you can just hang on to that question, we'll get there, okay? Okay, what is the technological instrument, website, app to utilize to obtain the assessment? As I mentioned, we have been using the CPALS Plus, is a tool that I mentioned earlier, developed by Susan Landry at the University of Texas Health Science Center. And so that is a tool that she and her team have developed. It's not something we developed. We're taking an existing tool, but it does, we think, provide a very nice screener and progress monitor measure in the areas of language and literacy and math. And so we've used it both in our language and literacy studies as well, and now we're getting ready to use it in our math project. We have developed through our IES funding an application. We've worked with a technology firm, a software company that has created for us an app that can be used on any computer tablet, but I think we're going to end up using an iPad. And then eventually, we hope that that will be made available. Once we've tested this through our research, we hope that Dr. Susan Landry will make this more widely available. It's not something we can make available because we're not the developer of the tool itself. We're just developing the application for using the assessment tool. So, do we have another question? Okay. We see there's some comments in there, but we don't see too many questions. I wish we could have a conversation face-to-face. It would be so much easier for us. It's hard when we can't see your faces. Okay, well, if I don't see any other questions, but if there, let's see, we got a comment from Molly right now. Okay, she's thanking you for attending and asking you to complete the evaluation. So I think Ellen and I are going to say thank you, and we're getting ready to sign off. It's been a pleasure. Again, we regret that we can't see you. We're used to being in front of teachers. We really enjoy interacting with teachers, and so it's hard for us to just look at a screen. It's not as much fun, but I hope that something today was worthwhile, and if you have questions for us, you can always email us, and we'd be happy to try to respond. So thank you for your attention and your time, and best of luck as you move forward in thinking about response to intervention early childhood. Bye-bye.
Oh, she hung up.